The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a water bill and grocery store flyers, and it threatened to freeze me to death in my own cabin. I stood there in my kitchen, reading the HOA notice for the third time, certain I had somehow misunderstood the words on the page. "Dear Mr. Nathanson," it began, "it has come to our attention that you are storing and utilizing propane tanks on your property in violation of Section 12.4 of the Mountain Ridge Estates Homeowner Association Guidelines. You have 14 days to remove all propane from the premises or face daily fines of $250. I looked up from the paper and stared out my window at the snow-covered pines of northern Montana. My cabin sat nestled in the mountains outside Whitefish, a place I'd saved for 10 years to buy. The propane heater hummed quietly in the corner, keeping the February cold at bay. Without it, the temperature inside would drop below freezing within hours. I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA office number listed at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered on the second ring. "Mountain Ridge Estates, HOA, this is Brenda speaking." "Hi, my name is Quinn Nathanson. I just received a letter about removing propane from my property." "Oh yes, Mr. Nathanson, what can I help you with? There must be some mistake. Propane is my only heat source. The cabin isn't connected to natural gas lines." "I'm just the secretary, sir. You'll need to speak with Patricia Sanderson, our HOA president. She handles all violations personally." "Can I speak with her now? She's conducting property inspections today. I can have her call you back." I left my number and spent the rest of the day researching HOA regulations. I'd bought the cabin 3 years ago. And yes, I'd signed the HOA documents during closing, but I'd been assured by my real estate agent that the rules were mostly about external appearances and noise complaints, nothing about heating restrictions. That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number. "Mr. Nathanson, this is Patricia Sanderson from the Mountain Ridge Estates HOA board." Her voice was crisp and professional, but there was an edge to it that made my jaw tighten. "Thanks for calling back. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the propane situation." "No misunderstanding. The rules are quite clear. But propane is my only heat source. The cabin doesn't have any other option." "That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the violation. Section 12.4 specifically prohibits the storage of flammable materials on residential properties." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. With all due respect, that section must have been written with something else in mind. Gasoline storage, maybe, or something actually dangerous. "People can't live here without heat. Perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing property in our community." "I've been living here for 3 years without any issues." "Yes. Well, we recently conducted a comprehensive review of all properties. Several violations have come to light. Yours is one of them." "So what am I supposed to do? Freeze? You could install electric heating, or move." The casual way she suggested I either spend tens of thousands of dollars or abandon my home made my blood pressure spike. This is insane. "I'm not removing my heat source in the middle of winter." "Then you'll be fined $250 per day starting March 1st. The 14-day grace period is quite generous, actually." "Good evening, Mr. Nathanson." She hung up before I could respond. I spent that night lying awake, listening to the propane heater that apparently made me a criminal in Patricia Sanderson's eyes. The wind howled outside, and the temperature gauge on my wall read 12 degrees. Without the heater, the cabin would become uninhabitable. The next morning, I drove into Whitefish and found a real estate attorney named David Carmichael. His office sat above a coffee shop on Central Avenue, and the smell of espresso filled the narrow stairwell. Come in," David said, waving me into his cluttered office. He was in his 60s with white hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. "Brenda mentioned you'd probably stop by. You know her, small town. Everyone knows everyone. Plus, I've handled a few HOA disputes over the years. What's Patricia got her claws into now?" I handed him the letter. He read it, frowned, and pulled out a thick binder from his bookshelf. "This is the Mountain Ridge Estates HOA covenant," he said, flipping through pages. "Let's see what Section 12.4 actually says." He ran his finger down the page, then stopped. "Huh. Well, she's technically correct. It says no flammable materials stored on properties. But the context here is clearly about things like gasoline for boats or ATVs, propane for recreational use, that sort of thing. This was never meant to apply to primary heating systems. Can you tell her that?" "I can, but Patricia Sanderson doesn't care much about intent. She cares about the letter of the law. Seen her drive 3 different homeowners out of the neighborhood over the past 2 years. Seriously. She forced Bill Martinez to tear down a shed he'd spent $5,000 building because it was 6 inches taller than regulations allowed. Made the Johnsons repaint their entire house because the shade of beige was, quote, not on the approved color palette. These people bought a beige house. It was already that color when they moved in. That's insane. That's Patricia. She retired from some corporate management position and decided to run the HOA like her personal fiefdom. The board is just her and 2 friends who rubber stamp whatever she wants. So what are my options?" David leaned back in his chair. "We can fight this. The intent argument might work with a judge, but HOA disputes are expensive and time-consuming. Could take 6 months, maybe a year. In the meantime, those fines would keep accumulating. How much would it cost to fight? Legal fees. Probably $10,000 to $15,000 if it goes to court." I felt sick. "And installing electric heat in a cabin that size. You're looking at a new electrical panel, baseboard heaters throughout, probably upgraded wiring. $30,000 minimum. Maybe more if they have to bring higher capacity power lines to your property. I don't have that kind of money just lying around. Most people don't. That's how HOAs like this operate. They know most folks can't afford to fight back." I left David's office feeling defeated. The cold air stung my face as I walked to my truck. Tourists wandered past, enjoying Whitefish's charm, completely unaware that just outside town, a petty tyrant was making people's lives miserable over nonsense regulations. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of. I attended the next HOA board meeting, held in the community center near the development entrance. Patricia sat at the head of a long table with her 2 board members, Susan Walker and Deborah Green, flanking her like loyal sentries. "Mr. Nathanson," Patricia said when I approached during the public comment period, "I assume you're here about the propane issue." "Yes. I'd like to request a variance or exception based on the fact that it's my primary heating system." "Denied." "Just like that. You won't even consider it." "The rules exist for everyone's safety. We can't make exceptions just because compliance is inconvenient." "Inconvenient? It's my only heat source in the middle of a Montana winter. This isn't about convenience. It's about basic habitability." Susan spoke up, her voice mousy and uncertain. "Patricia, maybe we could table this until spring. Give Mr. Nathanson time to make arrangements." Patricia turned to her with a look that could freeze water. "The rules don't have a seasonal exception clause, Susan." Susan immediately looked down at her notes and said nothing else. "This is ridiculous," I said. "You're going to force me to remove heat from my home in February. You have options, Mr. Nathanson. You're simply choosing not to pursue them because they require effort and expense. That's not my problem. You know what I think. I think this is about control. You get off on making people miserable. Patricia's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped to ice. Personal attacks won't help your case. You have 12 days remaining. If the propane isn't removed by March 1st, the fines begin. Next item on the agenda. I left the meeting furious and desperate. That weekend, I drove around the entire Mountain Ridge Estates development, which consisted of about 40 properties spread across the mountainside. I knocked on doors, introducing myself and explaining my situation. Most people were sympathetic, but scared to get involved. Patricia went after us last year over Christmas lights, one neighbor told me. Said they violated the external decoration policy. Cost us $800 in fines before we took them down. I'm sorry, but I can't afford to get on her bad side. Others had similar stories. The HOA had become Patricia's personal weapon, and she wielded it against anyone who didn't perfectly conform to her vision of what the neighborhood should be. But I did find a few allies. Tom Rodriguez, who lived 5 properties down from me, had been quietly documenting HOA abuses for over a year. She's running this place like a dictatorship, Tom said, inviting me into his cabin. His walls were covered with maps and printed documents. Look at this. Last year, the HOA collected $60,000 in dues from the 40 properties here. That's $1,500 per household. Know how much they spent on actual community improvements? $8,000. Snow plowing, road maintenance, that's it. What happened to the other $52,000? Management fees, consultant fees, legal fees. All going to companies owned by Patricia's family members or friends. It's embezzlement, basically, but it's hidden behind legitimate-sounding expenses. Have you reported this? To who? The HOA board, Patricia and her cronies. The county doesn't regulate HOAs. The state attorney general's office said it's a civil matter. Unless I can prove outright fraud with concrete evidence, they won't touch it. So she just gets away with it. So far, yeah, but I've been building a case. If we can get enough homeowners together, we could force a vote to remove her from the board. Problem is, everyone's too scared. I'm not scared, I'm pissed off, Tom grinned. Good, we need more people like you. Over the next week, Tom and I worked together. We created flyers explaining the propane situation and the broader pattern of HOA abuse. We delivered them to every house in Mountain Ridge Estates. Some people slammed doors in our faces. Others thanked us quietly and promised nothing, but a few people stepped forward. Sarah and Mike Chen had been fighting a battle over their fence height. Jennifer Walsh was being fined for having the wrong mailbox style. Carl Brecker had received a violation notice because his firewood stack was visible from the road. We organized a meeting at Tom's house. 9 homeowners showed up, which was more than I'd expected but fewer than we needed to force a board recall vote. Here's the thing, Tom explained to the group. According to the HOA bylaws, we need signatures from 51% of homeowners to call a special election. That's 21 households. We have 9. What if we can't get 21? Sarah Chen asked. Then we fight our individual battles and hope we win enough to discredit Patricia's authority. Or we find evidence of actual wrongdoing, I added. Tom says the finances don't add up. If we can prove fraud, we could get the authorities involved. Jennifer Walsh shook her head. I'm an accountant. I've looked at the HOA financial statements they're required to provide. They're vague but not technically illegal. Patricia's smart. She keeps everything just clean enough to avoid criminal charges. There has to be something we can do, I said. There is, Tom replied. We make noise. We contact local media. We show up at every board meeting. We make Patricia's life as difficult as she's making ours. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. The next day, I called the Whitefish Pilot, the local newspaper. A reporter named Angela Ellis agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. "I've heard stories about Patricia Sanderson," Angela said, pulling out a notebook. "But no one's ever been willing to go on record. People are scared of retaliation." "I'll go on record. I've got nothing to lose at this point." I explained the entire situation. Angela took notes, asked questions, and promised to look into it. 3 days later, the story ran on the front page of the local news section. HOA forces homeowner to choose between heat and fines, the headline read. The article detailed my situation and included comments from Patricia, who defended the HOA's position. "Rules exist to maintain property values and ensure community safety," she was quoted as saying. "Mr. Nathanson is being unreasonable and trying to garner sympathy rather than comply with regulations he agreed to when he purchased his property." The article also mentioned the other homeowners who'd experienced similar issues, though most declined to be named. Tom Rodriguez was quoted extensively about the financial irregularities. "I thought the publicity would help. I was wrong." The morning after the article published, I found my mailbox knocked over. Someone had spray-painted "Troublemaker" across my front door in red letters. My propane tank had a dent in it, like someone had hit it with a baseball bat. I called the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. A deputy came out, took photos, and filed a report. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I've been in a dispute with the HOA president. There was an article in the newspaper yesterday." The deputy, whose name tag read Martinez, nodded. "I read it. My cousin Bill lives in this development. Patricia drove him nuts a couple years back. This doesn't seem like her style, though. Maybe not her personally, but she has friends on the board. Without evidence, there's not much I can do. I'll increase patrols in the area, but vandalism cases are tough without witnesses." After he left, I spent the day cleaning spray paint off my door and straightening my mailbox. The temperature had dropped to 5 degrees, and my propane heater worked overtime to keep the cabin warm. That evening, Patricia called me directly. "I saw what happened to your property," she said. "I want you to know the HOA board does not condone vandalism or threats of any kind. Funny timing, though, right after the newspaper article. I had nothing to do with that. But I will say this, Mr. Nathanson. You're making enemies in this community. People don't appreciate troublemakers who drag the neighborhood's name through the mud. I'm not the one enforcing insane rules. You have 7 days to remove the propane. The fines start March 1st, whether you like it or not. If you can't afford to live here under our community standards, perhaps you should sell and move somewhere more appropriate for your income level." The condescension in her voice made me want to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I took a breath and said, "I'm not leaving, and I'm not removing my heat source." "Then I'll see you in court, Mr. Nathanson." She hung up. That night, Tom called with news. "I've been going through old HOA meeting minutes, found something interesting. Back when Mountain Ridge Estates was first developed, the original HOA documents included a grandfather clause for existing structures and systems. When someone bought a property with an existing feature, that feature was protected from future rule changes. Does that apply to me? Potentially. Your cabin existed before you bought it. The propane heating system was already installed. If we can argue that the system is grandfathered, Patricia can't touch it. Did you tell David Carmichael about this? Calling him tomorrow. This could be our way out." I felt hope for the first time in days. The next morning, I met with David at his office. Tom came along, bringing printed copies of the original HOA documents from 2003, when the development was first established. David read through them carefully, making notes in the margins. After 20 minutes, he looked up with a grim expression. "This is good, but there's a problem." In 2015, the HOA board passed an amendment that removed the grandfather clause. All properties had to comply with current regulations within 5 years. That deadline passed in 2020. Can they do that? I asked. If the amendment was passed properly, yes. It requires a vote of the board and notification to all homeowners. Tom leaned forward. How were homeowners notified? Should be in the meeting minutes. Let me see. David flipped through Tom's documents. Here. Special meeting held August 2015. Board voted unanimously to pass Amendment 7B, removing Section 3.2 grandfather protections. Notice was posted in the community newsletter and mailed to all homeowners of record. I didn't get any notice, I said. You didn't own your property in 2015. The previous owner would have received it. So I'm screwed. David tapped his pen on the desk. Not necessarily. We can challenge whether the previous owner had adequate time to address the changes. 5 years sounds reasonable, but if the heating system is integral to the property's habitability, we might argue that removing it constitutes a taking without compensation. What's a taking? Legal term. Basically, if the government or an HOA takes away so much of your property's use that it becomes worthless, they might owe you compensation. It's a stretch, but it's an argument. How much would this cost to pursue? We're back to the 10 to 15,000 range. Maybe more if it gets complicated. I rubbed my face with both hands. Every option required money I didn't have or forced me to choose between freezing and bankruptcy. There's one other thing we could try, Tom said. Recall the board. If we get 21 signatures, we can force an election. New board members might be more reasonable. You have 9 people, David said. Where are you getting the other 12? We keep trying. The newspaper article got people talking. Maybe some of the scared homeowners will find their courage. Over the next 3 days, Tom and I went door to door again. The vandalism to my property had actually helped in a twisted way. Some people were appalled that things had escalated to that level. Others saw it as proof that Patricia's influence was toxic. By February 28th, we had 17 signatures. Close, but not enough. That evening, I sat in my cabin, staring at the propane heater. Tomorrow, the fines would start. $250 per day added up to $7,500 per month. I couldn't afford that for even a few weeks. My phone rang. It was Angela Ellis from the newspaper. Quinn, I've been digging into the HOA's financial records. Tom was right about the irregularities. I found something you need to see. What is it? Patricia's been billing the HOA for management consulting services through a company called Mountain Management Solutions. I looked up the business registration. It's owned by her husband, Richard Sanderson. She's been funneling HOA funds directly to her family. Is that illegal? It violates the HOA's conflict of interest policy. Board members aren't supposed to financially benefit from their position. It might not be criminal, but it's definitely grounds for removal. Can you publish this? I'm working on a follow-up article, but there's more. Some of the legal fees the HOA paid went to a law firm that doesn't exist. I can't find any record of Hammond and Associates anywhere. No business license, no website, nothing. That sounds like fraud. That sounds like something the police should investigate. Hope surged through me again. What do we need to do? I've already contacted the Flathead County Attorney's office. They're interested, but they'll need more evidence. Can Tom provide his documentation? I'll call him right now. I spent the rest of the night with Tom, gathering every piece of evidence we had. Financial statements, meeting minutes, emails, and letters. We compiled everything into a single file and sent it to Angela and the county attorney's office. March 1st arrived. The fines officially started. That morning, I received an email from Patricia. Dear Mr. Nathanson, as of today, you are accruing fines of $250 per day for violation of HOA regulations regarding flammable material storage. Payment is due by the end of each month. Failure to pay will result in additional late fees and potential legal action, including property liens. Respectfully, Patricia Sanderson, HOA President. I deleted the email and went about my day. 2 days later, Angela's follow-up article ran. HOA President under investigation for financial improprieties. The headline blared. The article detailed everything we'd found. Patricia's conflict of interest, the suspicious legal fees, the pattern of aggressive enforcement that drove homeowners out of the neighborhood. Angela had even interviewed some of the people who'd sold their properties and left, and they all told similar stories of harassment and unreasonable fines. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, my phone started ringing. Homeowners who'd been too scared to sign the recall petition now wanted in. By the end of the day, Tom and I had 32 signatures. We scheduled an emergency special meeting for March 5th to hold a vote on removing Patricia and the existing board members. Patricia tried to block it, claiming the petition was invalid due to technical errors. David Carmichael responded with a letter explaining that the petition met all legal requirements and threatening a lawsuit if the HOA refused to hold the election. The meeting took place in the community center. Nearly every homeowner showed up, which was unprecedented. Patricia sat at the head table with Susan and Deborah, looking calm but tense. Tom stood to speak first. We're here today because our HOA board has lost sight of its purpose. Instead of serving the community, it's become a tool for harassment and personal enrichment. We have documented evidence of financial mismanagement and conflicts of interest. Patricia Sanderson has turned this neighborhood into her personal kingdom, and we're here to take it back. People applauded. Patricia's jaw tightened. These are baseless accusations, Patricia said when Tom sat down. I've served this community for 5 years. Property values have increased. We've maintained high standards. You've terrorized people, someone shouted from the back. You stole from us, another voice called out. The meeting devolved into chaos. People stood up, yelling accusations and complaints. Patricia tried to maintain order, but she'd lost the room. David Carmichael, acting as parliamentarian, called for order and proceeded with the vote. By a margin of 34-6, the homeowners voted to remove Patricia, Susan, and Deborah from the board. A new election would be held within 30 days to select replacements. Patricia stood, her face white with rage. This is a witch hunt. You're all making a terrible mistake. This community will fall apart without proper leadership. We'll take our chances, Tom said. Patricia gathered her papers and walked out. Susan and Deborah scurried after her like mice fleeing a sinking ship. The room erupted in cheers after they left. People shook my hand and clapped Tom on the back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe things would be okay. But the story wasn't over yet. A week later, 2 investigators from the Montana Attorney General's office showed up at Patricia's house. Angela Ellis called me with the news. They're investigating her for fraud and embezzlement. Turns out that fake law firm, Hammond and Associates. Patricia created it herself. She billed the HOA over $40,000 for legal services that never happened. The money went straight into an account she controlled. Holy shit. The county attorney is considering criminal charges. This could be a felony. 3 days after that, Patricia Sanderson was arrested. The local news covered it extensively. She was charged with theft by deception, fraud, and embezzlement. Her bail was set at $50,000. The new HOA board, elected 2 weeks later, was a group of reasonable people who actually wanted to serve the community. Tom Rodriguez became president. Their first official act was to rescind my propane violation notice and refund any fines that had accrued, which totaled $750 for the 3 days they'd been in effect. They also voted to amend Section 12.4 to explicitly allow propane and other fuel sources used for primary heating systems. Several other ridiculous rules were struck down as well. I attended the meeting where these changes were announced. The atmosphere was completely different from the meetings under Patricia's reign. People were smiling, joking, actually engaged in a positive way. "We're going back to what an HOA should be," Tom said during his opening remarks. "A group of neighbors working together to maintain our community, not a dictatorship enforcing arbitrary rules." Everyone applauded. Over the following months, things improved dramatically. The HOA hired an independent accountant to audit the finances and implement proper oversight. They discovered additional irregularities beyond what we'd initially found. Patricia had been embezzling money for years, totaling over $100,000. Her trial was held in June. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery and watching the woman who tried to freeze me out of my home face justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors showed fake invoices, fraudulent billing statements, and bank records proving Patricia had diverted HOA funds for personal use. She'd bought a boat, taken expensive vacations, and renovated her kitchen, all with money stolen from her neighbors. Her defense attorney tried to argue that the HOA accounting was simply disorganized and that Patricia had made mistakes rather than intentionally stealing. But the paper trail was too clear. She'd created false companies, forged documents, and lied repeatedly to cover her tracks. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Patricia's sentencing hearing was in August. I made a victim impact statement, explaining how her abuse of power had nearly cost me my home and subjected me to harassment and vandalism. "She didn't just steal money," I told the judge. "She stole people's peace of mind. She made us afraid in our own homes. She used her position to bully and intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. That kind of abuse of trust deserves serious consequences." Other homeowners spoke as well. Sarah Chen talked about the stress that affected her family. Carl Brecker explained how he'd considered selling his property just to escape the harassment. Jennifer Walsh broke down crying while describing the anxiety she'd felt every time she received a letter from the HOA. The judge listened to everything carefully. When it was time for sentencing, she didn't mince words. "Miss Sanderson, you were given a position of trust within your community. Instead of serving your neighbors, you exploited them for personal gain. You stole money, abused your authority, and created an atmosphere of fear. This court sentences you to 5 years in the Montana Women's Prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. You are also ordered to make full restitution of all stolen funds, totaling $143,000. Patricia's face crumpled. Her husband, Richard, who'd been implicated but not charged due to insufficient evidence, sat stone-faced in the gallery. As the bailiff led Patricia away, she looked back at the courtroom one last time. Her eyes found mine, and for a moment, I saw something other than the imperious control freak I'd been battling. I saw a broken woman who destroyed her own life through greed and arrogance. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After the sentencing, several of us went to a restaurant in Whitefish to celebrate, if that was the right word for it. Nobody was happy about what had happened. We'd all been hurt by Patricia's actions in one way or another, but there was relief that it was finally over. "To justice," Tom said, raising his glass. "To justice," we all echoed. The new HOA board continued to reform the organization. They implemented term limits so no one person could dominate the board for years. They required transparent financial reporting with quarterly audits. They established a grievance process so homeowners could appeal violation notices to an independent review panel. Most importantly, they changed the culture. Mountain Ridge Estates stopped being a place where people lived in fear of arbitrary rules and started becoming an actual community. I spent the rest of that summer working on my cabin. I added a backup electric heating system, not because anyone required it, but because having redundancy made sense in Montana winters. I also built a woodshed, which would have been forbidden under Patricia's reign, but was now perfectly acceptable as long as it met basic safety standards. My neighbors helped. Tom came over with his tools and spent a weekend helping me pour the concrete foundation for the shed. The Chens donated some lumber they had left over from their own projects. Carl Brecker, who turned out to be a retired carpenter, volunteered his expertise to make sure everything was built properly. We had a barbecue when the shed was finished. People from all over the development showed up. We grilled burgers and drank beer and watched the sun set over the mountains. Kids ran around playing tag while adults swapped stories and laughed. "This is what it should have been all along," Tom said, standing next to me with a beer in his hand. "Yeah," I agreed. Just people living their lives without someone breathing down their necks over nonsense. You know, if you hadn't fought back, none of this would have happened. We'd still be under Patricia's thumb. I just wanted to keep my heat on. I didn't set out to start a revolution. Sometimes that's how revolutions start. One person saying enough is enough. I thought about that. Tom was right, in a way. I'd been pushed into a corner and forced to fight back. I'd been lucky that other people joined me, that we'd found evidence of actual crimes, that the system had worked the way it was supposed to. Not everyone in HOA disputes gets that lucky. I knew there were thousands of people across the country dealing with petty tyrants like Patricia, but without the resources or support to fight back. That thought bothered me. In September, Angela Ellis called me. She was working on a longer piece about HOA abuses for a regional magazine and wanted to include my story. "I think this is a bigger problem than people realize," she said. "HOAs operate with very little oversight. They have tremendous power over people's lives, but there's minimal accountability. What can be done about it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Some states have passed HOA reform laws. Better financial transparency requirements, easier pathways for homeowners to challenge rules, that kind of thing. Montana doesn't have much in the way of regulation. Maybe that should change. I'm planning to send my article to some state legislators, see if anyone's interested in pursuing reforms. Let me know if I can help." The article came out in October. It was published in Montana Monthly and picked up by several other regional publications. Angela did a great job telling not just my story, but also explaining the broader context of HOA abuses and the lack of oversight. I received emails from people across Montana and neighboring states who'd experienced similar situations. Some had won their battles, but many had lost. They'd been forced to sell their homes, pay ridiculous fines, or make expensive modifications to comply with arbitrary rules. Reading those emails made me realize how fortunate I'd been. The fact that Patricia had committed actual crimes meant we could get law enforcement involved. But what about HOAs that stayed just inside the legal lines while still making people miserable? Those homeowners had far fewer options. In November, a state representative named Catherine Walsh contacted me. She represented a district near Missoula and had read Angela's article. I'm planning to introduce legislation to reform HOA oversight in Montana, she told me during a phone call. I'd like to include some provisions based on your experience. Would you be willing to testify at a committee hearing? Absolutely. Great. I'm working on the bill now. It would require HOAs to have independent financial audits, establish clear appeals processes for violation notices, and prevent boards from enforcing rules that make properties uninhabitable. It would also create a state ombudsman position to investigate complaints of HOA abuse. That sounds like exactly what's needed. It won't solve everything, but it's a start. HOAs serve a purpose, but they need proper checks and balances like any other organization with power over people's lives. Over the winter, I worked with Representative Walsh and her staff to refine the bill. We incorporated input from other homeowners who'd been affected by HOA abuses. The goal was to create reasonable oversight without making it impossible for HOAs to function. The bill was introduced in the Montana legislature in January of the following year. I drove to Helena to testify before the House Local Government Committee. The hearing room was packed. Representatives from various HOA management companies opposed the bill, arguing it would create unnecessary bureaucracy and expense. But homeowners showed up in droves to support it. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story. I explained how Patricia Sanderson had tried to force me to remove my only heat source in the middle of winter, how she'd terrorized an entire neighborhood, and how she'd ultimately been sent to prison for stealing from the people she was supposed to serve. HOAs are supposed to protect property values and maintain communities, I said. But without oversight, they can become tools of oppression. We need reasonable regulations to prevent abuses while still allowing HOAs to serve their legitimate purpose. This bill strikes that balance. The committee members asked thoughtful questions. Some were skeptical about government intervention in private community associations. Others were clearly sympathetic to the horror stories they were hearing. After several more hearings and some amendments, the bill passed out of committee. It went to the full House, where it passed by a comfortable margin. The Senate was trickier, with some members opposing it as government overreach, but it eventually passed there too. In March, the governor signed the Montana HOA Reform Act into law. It wouldn't take effect until January of the following year, giving HOAs time to come into compliance, but it was a genuine victory. Representative Walsh called me after the signing ceremony. "We did it, Quinn. This is going to help a lot of people. Thank you for taking this on. Thank you for speaking up. None of this would have happened if you hadn't fought back." As spring arrived and the snow melted from the mountains around my cabin, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year. It had been exhausting and stressful and expensive in ways I hadn't anticipated, but it had also been worth it. Patricia Sanderson was in prison. The Mountain Ridge Estates HOA was functioning properly. State law had been changed to protect other homeowners from similar abuses. And I still had my cabin, with my propane heater humming quietly in the corner. One evening in April, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tom walked up the path from his cabin, carrying 2 beers. "Thought you might want one of these," he said, handing me a bottle. "Thanks." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade over the mountains. "You ever think about how differently this could have turned out?" Tom asked. "All the time. If we hadn't found the financial evidence, if Angela hadn't written those articles, if people hadn't been willing to sign the recall petition. Any one of those things goes differently, and I'm probably bankrupt or homeless right now. But they didn't go differently. We won. We got lucky. Maybe. But we also worked our asses off. We didn't give up when things looked hopeless. He was right. Yes, we'd been fortunate in many ways, but we'd also fought for every inch of ground, documented everything, and refused to back down even when the easier path would have been to surrender. "Here's to not giving up," I said, raising my beer. "To not giving up," Tom echoed. We clinked bottles and drank as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The following months were peaceful in a way they hadn't been since I'd first bought the cabin. The HOA sent out newsletters about actual community events rather than violation notices. People showed up to board meetings to discuss real issues like road maintenance and snow removal, rather than to hear Patricia pontificate about property standards. I became friends with many of my neighbors. We helped each other with projects, shared tools and skills, and actually functioned like a community should. It was remarkable how quickly things improved once the atmosphere of fear and resentment was removed. In June, I received a letter from the Montana Women's Prison. It was from Patricia Sanderson. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Patricia's handwriting. "Mr. Nathanson," it began, "I'm writing to apologize for my actions. I spent months in therapy here, working to understand how I became the person I was. I had convinced myself that I was serving the community, maintaining standards, protecting property values. In reality, I was feeding my own need for control and validation. I hurt a lot of people, including you. I stole from my neighbors and betrayed their trust. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I hope the community has recovered from the damage I caused. Sincerely, Patricia Sanderson." I read the letter twice, trying to decide how I felt about it. Part of me appreciated the apology. It took courage to acknowledge wrongdoing and take responsibility. But another part of me remembered the stress, the fear, and the very real possibility that I could have lost my home because of her actions. I filed the letter away and didn't respond. Maybe that made me petty, but I wasn't ready to offer forgiveness. Perhaps I never would be. That was okay. Patricia would have to live with the consequences of her choices, and I would move forward with my life. Summer turned to fall, and the aspens around my cabin blazed gold against the evergreens. I took time off work to hike the trails I'd been too stressed to enjoy the previous year. The mountains had always been my sanctuary, and it felt good to reclaim that sense of peace. In October, the first anniversary of Patricia's arrest, Tom organized a community gathering at the Mountain Ridge Estate's common area. We roasted marshmallows around a fire pit and shared stories. Some people talked about their experiences during Patricia's reign of terror, but mostly we just enjoyed each other's company. "You know what's crazy?" Sarah Chen said. "A year ago, most of us barely knew each other. We were all just isolated in our properties, trying to avoid getting on Patricia's radar. Now I can't get rid of you people," her husband Mike joked. "Tom's over at our place all the time borrowing tools." "That's because you have better tools than me," Tom shot back, and everyone laughed. It was true, though. The shared struggle had forged genuine relationships among us. We'd become actual neighbors instead of just people who happened to own property near each other. As the fire died down and people started heading home, I lingered, staring into the embers. Tom sat down next to me. "You did good, Quinn. We all did." "Yeah, but you started it. You were the first one to really push back." "I didn't have much choice. It was fight or freeze." "There's always a choice. You could have tried to install electric heat or sold the place or just paid the fines. But you stood your ground. So did you. You'd been documenting her abuses for a year before I even knew there was a problem. And I wasn't doing anything with it, just collecting information and hoping someone else would step up. You actually stepped up. We sat in silence for a while longer. The night was cold but not bitter, and stars filled the sky above us in a way they never did in cities. "What would you have done differently?" Tom asked. "If you could go back and do it all again," I thought about that. "I would have read those HOA documents more carefully before buying the property, would have understood what I was signing up for." "Would you have bought the place anyway?" "Probably. This cabin is exactly what I wanted." And honestly, even knowing what I know now about Patricia and the HOA nightmare, I think I'd still buy it, because it led to all this. I gestured around at the community center, the dark shapes of cabins on the hillside, the whole neighborhood that had been transformed. "We made something better here." "Yeah, we did." Winter came early that year, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping below zero, but my cabin stayed warm, heated by the propane system that had started this whole ordeal. I'd added a backup generator and the supplemental electric heat, so I had redundancy now. But the propane heater remained my primary heat source, humming quietly and keeping the cold at bay. I thought sometimes about other homeowners across the country who were probably dealing with their own Patricia Sandersons. HOA tyrants who wielded petty rules like weapons, who made life miserable for people just trying to live in their homes. I hoped that some of them would find the courage to fight back like we had. And I hoped that more states would pass reform legislation to rein in the worst abuses. The Montana HOA Reform Act went into effect on January 1st, and Mountain Ridge estates quickly came into compliance. We'd already implemented most of the requirements, so it was just a matter of formalizing things. Other HOAs across the state had a harder time adjusting, but that was their problem. In February, exactly 2 years after I'd received that first violation notice, I stood in my kitchen holding my morning coffee and looking out at the snow-covered landscape. My propane heater hummed in the corner. My cabin was warm and comfortable. Outside, smoke rose from chimneys across the neighborhood as people heated their homes in whatever way worked best for them. I thought about everything that had happened. The fear and anger I'd felt when Patricia threatened my home. The exhaustion of fighting back. The satisfaction of watching her arrested and convicted. The joy of helping pass legislation to protect others. And finally, the peace of knowing I could live in my cabin without looking over my shoulder. It had been a hell of a journey, but I'd made it through. We all had. And Mountain Ridge Estates was better for it. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Board meeting tonight. Think we can keep it under an hour this time?" I smiled and typed back. "If we're lucky, see you there." The meetings were boring now in the best possible way. We discussed snow removal schedules and whether to repaint the community center. Nobody threatened anyone or enforced absurd rules. We just handled the mundane business of maintaining a neighborhood. It was exactly as it should be. That evening, I drove to the community center for the meeting. About 15 homeowners showed up, which was typical these days. We reviewed the budget, approved some minor repairs to the entrance gate, and discussed plans for a 4th of July barbecue. The whole thing took 45 minutes. As we filed out afterward, Sarah Chen caught up to me in the parking lot. "Hey Quinn, Mike and I are having people over Saturday night for dinner. You should come." "Yeah, definitely. What can I bring? Just yourself. We're doing fondue. Should be fun." It was such a normal interaction. Neighbors inviting each other over for dinner. Nothing dramatic or stressful or requiring legal intervention. Just normal life in a normal community. That's what we'd fought for, I realized. Not for victory or revenge or even justice, though those things mattered. We'd fought to reclaim normalcy. To live in our homes without fear or harassment. To be neighbors instead of victims, and we'd won. I drove back to my cabin that night feeling genuinely content. The road wound through the pines, snow banked high on either side. My headlights caught a deer at the edge of the forest, watching me pass with alert eyes. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. This was home. This was worth fighting for. Inside my cabin, I started a fire in the wood stove and settled into my favorite chair with a book. The propane heater hummed. The fire crackled. Outside, the temperature dropped toward zero, but I was warm and safe. 2 years ago, Patricia Sanderson had tried to take this away from me. She tried to force me out of my home for no reason other than a technicality in some rule she'd probably written herself. But she'd failed. Justice had prevailed, not because the system was perfect, but because people had been willing to stand up and fight for what was right. I hoped Patricia was learning something in prison. I hoped she'd become a better person, though that wasn't really my concern anymore. She'd made her choices and faced the consequences. Her story was over as far as I was concerned. My story continued. Here in this cabin, in this community, in these mountains I loved. With neighbors who'd become friends. With the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference, not just for myself but for others too. The fire burned low, and I added another log. Outside, snow began to fall, fat flakes drifting past the window. I pulled a blanket over my lap and continued reading, occasionally glancing up to watch the snow accumulate. Tomorrow I'd probably need to shovel the driveway. Maybe I'd help Tom with his too. Sarah had mentioned they needed help moving some furniture. There was always something to do, always ways to help out. That's what community meant. Not rules and fines and violation notices. Just people helping each other, looking out for one another, making life a little easier and better. Patricia had never understood that. She'd thought community meant control, conformity, and rigid adherence to arbitrary standards. She'd been wrong, and it had cost her everything. We'd built something better in the aftermath of her downfall, not perfect but good. A place where people could live their lives without fear, where an HOA served its members instead of terrorizing them. I finished my chapter and set the book aside. The fire had burned down to coals and the cabin was cozy warm. I checked the propane gauge out of habit. Half full. Plenty for the rest of the winter. Standing at the window, I looked out at the falling snow and the dark shapes of neighboring cabins, lights glowing warmly in their windows. Somewhere out there, Tom was probably watching the same snow. Sarah and Mike were maybe putting their kids to bed. Carl was likely working in his shop. All of us living our lives, heating our homes however we chose, free from the tyranny of a petty HOA dictator. It had taken a fight to get here, but we'd won. And that victory meant everything. I went to bed that night with snow still falling outside and warmth radiating from the propane heater that had started this whole adventure. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt profoundly grateful. Not just for the cabin or the heat or the community, but for the reminder that standing up to injustice mattered. One person saying no to unreasonable demands. One person refusing to be bullied. One person willing to fight back. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.